This is episode 447 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, we had the second debate for governor of the state of New Mexico last Wednesday. This one was on Channel 7 KOAT. And just as a beginning point, and I don't know what your thoughts are, but I thought it was a much better debate. More issues were brought forth in the debate than in the Channel 4 debate, specifically the Energy Transition Act, which we talk about fairly regularly here on this show. But it just, I think, did a little bit better job of fleshing out the governor candidate's positions. Specifically, crime, as always, is the starting point. And, you know, I know we've talked about this as well. Crime in a governor's race kind of leaves me a little cold when there are so many things that the governor can and has done that are pretty firmly under their control. Crime is partially under the governor's control, partially under city of Albuquerque's control, partially under the judge's control, partially under the district attorney's control. It's there are many hands in that pot, but overall, I thought Ronchetti won on points, as he did the KOB poll. That's on the issues alone. And then when it came to the body language and just, if you watched the debate, who was the more likable, who was kind of the candidate that you think would better represent your state. Michelle Lujan Grisham, only if you're watching this on YouTube or television can you see, but she very much wrapped her hands in front of her like mom facing a pouty 2-year-old and really made herself seem very uninterested or unwilling to even engage on the issues with Ronchetti. And I thought that was not something that made her look very good. And the only thing before I hand it over to you, Wally, is that the sexual harassment payout was made an issue by Ronchetti. I think that is a very, while it doesn't make me very excited as an issue, it is certainly a concern given the governor's ostensible advocacy for open government and transparency, that she made a substantial payout of at least $150,000 to James Hallinan. And really, there's been not a lot of debate and questioning of that from the media. So it was good that that was entered into the record, so to speak.
Yeah, and starting from the top, Paul, the body language, I don't know who was doing her debate prep, but she either doesn't do that in debate prep or she has somebody that's working with her that's afraid to tell her. It's like, Governor, that's not a good look, because she came across to me is kind of like in a courtroom as a hostile witness. It's one of those where she would close her eyes, tilt her head back, just a lot of awkwardness that you could tell that was not that was something she knew she had to do. And she came across to me as not wishing she could have just bypassed that and been coronated for a second term, but she had to do it. Yes, the issues were broader, brought up more. And then Paul, also on the crime, direct crime, I think that you're right, that, things like Albuquerque's police department, city council of Albuquerque have more on a day-to-day basis, but there was a lot of legislation passed that was not law enforcement friendly, and actually probably not municipal friendly, relative to the qualified immunity for law enforcement, that we've kind of gone in a way different direction. So I do think that there is a lot coming from Santa Fe. And then also, the governor has a bully pulpit that she feels very comfortable using on things like related to energy and, the Green New Deal and New Mexico's version of that. but she doesn't really like to talk about that as even an issue. And so I think that left Ron Ketty a lot of open field to address that issue, because that's nothing the governor even talks about as something that is impacting the state and important. And the question now is that how many undecided voters are there, and were any of their minds changed, or were they even watching the debates, or are the debates much more for the political partisans and the people that are, already made their mind up and looking for confirmation? We'll have to see how that plays. And then you may be going to talk about a little bit, but there's also a third-party candidate, which third-party candidates tend to hurt one candidate and help another. And that is another issue that's probably going to be fleshed out when the polls close here in November.
Yeah, no, I think the body language was critical, and there was footage, or a picture, I should say, released from, kind of behind the scenes in the Channel 7 debate. And you saw for yourself, if you saw that picture, the governor was again seated. I've heard, that the likely excuse is her knee, which of course she's had surgery on back in the DC area. But my understanding was that she was never going to appear alongside Ron Ketty standing up, because that's not her preference. So that both debates involved her sitting. And I think that negatively impacts whoever is seated relative to whoever is standing. Something else, and I'll put this in the category of dogs that didn't bark, again, and I agree with you on the qualified immunity. It's something we talked about during the legislative session last year when it was passed, and had some concerns with, and still do. And I think that has a real impact, maybe not as much in the policy aspect, but certainly in the kind of do the politicians of New Mexico support me as a law enforcement officer, that kind of the bully pulpit, if you will. Don't know how many times it's actually come up and been made relevant in a case, and how much it looms in the minds of officers. But again, and perhaps more so than any other issue during the time of Lujan Grisham being in office, one person making the rules has been the COVID issue. And I know, and I assume from what I've heard, that the Ron Ketty people have polling data showing that that's not a real advantage for them. I find that to be shocking and unbelievable, and perhaps a sad testament to the compliance of New Mexico's voters, because again, this governor has maintained an iron lock on power, and really defied everything that you would want to hear and want to believe about so-called small d democracy during that time period, really taking it upon herself to make those decisions. And that really wasn't an issue in either debate, COVID and COVID protocols. The only specific time that it came up was, as I recall, in the first debate, when towards the end of their argument, it was discussed about education plans and what Ron Ketty is going to try to do to close that gap. But the decision to keep kids out of school for a year, and the science of COVID, or the lack thereof, was not really discussed at any time, and hasn't been the subject of any ad campaigns so far as I've seen. I'm limited to my rabbit ears at home. I don't have the full package of cable or satellite, but I haven't seen any ads really targeting the COVID issue. And as we discussed over the last 2.5 years, COVID was a tough issue to deal with in March and April. We'll even throw in May of 2020, but certainly by late summer of 2020, and then for the last couple of years since then, it's pretty straightforward what has worked, what hasn't worked, and which state governors did the right thing, i.e. South Dakota, Florida, which states did the wrong thing, New Mexico, California, Hawaii, et cetera. So anyway, that's just one of those things. You know, sometimes it falls to guys like us, Wally, to talk about the things that are left on the cutting room floor or left out of the talking points in a debate.
Yeah, and Paula, you know, I have the same opinion that you is almost the only way that seems like it probably polling well to even address with the COVID management here in New Mexico is the education issue. And, you know, a population of students that were not doing that well, and now we're way, way, way behind. And, you know, it is, you know, I remember saying this, like, there are tough decisions to be made during the COVID. And, you know, early on, the official approach was that lockdowns are very effective, masks are very effective, and the vaccine is very effective. And as all of those things came into question and showed that maybe that wasn't the way it was going to work, it, you know, opened that issue up more. But I don't think that I don't think New Mexicans kind of see it that way, to be honest. And like you say, maybe a little bit disappointing, but I think that the electorate in New Mexico is frankly more comfortable with putting all that power in the hands of one person in that emergency, even after we've seen that it maybe was not nearly as effective or successful as we'd like. And that, you know, that is something that means that issue is off the table from a debate point of view. Education, not so much, but man, we need to do something about education, not just throw money at it. Let's get some effectiveness.
Well, you're speaking ahead of the talking points here, but you're also summarizing the very real frustration that reform-minded folks, certainly the Rio Grande Foundation, has in New Mexico. And whatever the results of the election may be, the fact that this governor with this track record isn't getting absolutely blown out is a testament to the lack of willingness among most voters in New Mexico to hold their elected officials responsible and to make them really represent a higher level of understanding than maybe average people can understand for themselves. I don't think that New Mexicans demand enough of their political leaders, certainly when it comes to effectively leveraging the powers of governments and especially the legislature, which, as unaccountable as I see this governor having been, the legislature has continued largely unchanged for the better part of 90 years. It's moved ideologically further to the left, but has not really switched parties at all. You've had one branch or the other at certain times, but it's really been one party rule writ large for not just decades, for the better part of the century. And until the voters demands 50th, 49th, 51st, 52nd is not where they want to be, we're going to continue basically down this path. And I want to hit on that education issue you just mentioned, because fact checking is one of those businesses these days that tends to have a little bit of a bad name. Fact checking was largely relegated to websites like Snopes.com pre-2016 election. Then the left, not just in New Mexico, but around the country, refused to blame Hillary Clinton and her terrible personality or campaign for the loss of 2016, and instead blames Russians and Facebook and a whole host of other things. So we suddenly got this cottage industry of fact checkers that really were very active during the Trump years and have kind of gone AWOL here under the Biden administration. And Biden certainly says as many non sequiturs and completely outrageous things as Trump did, but the fact checking has been far less prominent. But the Channel 13 KRQE did a fact check on whether Governor Lujan Grisham has a plan for education. We've talked about Ron Keddy's plan. We've talked about the pluses, the minuses, the it's okay aspects of Ron Keddy's plan, but it's 6 pages. It's on his website. You can go find it for yourself. We've also discussed and asserted ourselves that Lujan Grisham really has no plan for education. And that is the basis of the KRQE fact check. And so their conclusion, as they talked to Delaney Corcoran, the spokesperson for Lujan Grisham's campaign, she's quoted as saying, the governor does have a plan. The plan is to continue, quote, making investments in education across the state. Now, spending more money is, factually speaking, yes, a plan. It is not an actual plan that has not been tried before. In fact, it's a plan that has been tried by this governor, by Susana Martinez, by Bill Richardson, by even Gary Johnson. So spending money has been done and done and done, and we haven't really moved the needle, as the Albuquerque Journal and many others have noted, either recently or further into the past. So yes, it is a plan. It is a plan that has failed and failed again and again and again. So maybe it's factually more accurate to say it is a poor plan. It is kind of like that wall that Lujan Grisham banged into in one of her first ads when she ran for governor. And except your head doesn't make it through the wall, it just kind of bounces backwards and you get a massive headache. Well, banging your head again against the wall is a plan, and doing it again and again and again is a plan. However, it is a plan that's failed and failed again. So, again, fact checking, kind of a funny way to do things, but there you go, Wally. The plan is to spend more money.
Yes. And, Paul, I don't mean to put you on the spot. We have not talked about this off the air, but, Think New Mexico has an education plan that they came out with, and you may not be ready to fully talk about it, but it has 10 points about things that are not just spend more money. So that is when I see what a plan is, or, actions, and again, I'm not weighing in pro or con on the Think New Mexico quote unquote plan, because I've just started to study it now, but that is an example of something you do, because spending more money, yeah, that's something, but poorly spent money that's not being effectively used right now, from all of the things that go into what provides quality education and achievement by our students, is not the answer. We certainly need something else. Or, if we always do what we've always done, we're always going to get the same result. And we have a pretty, we're turning into the Washington Generals, not the Harlem Globetrotters, when it comes to education success. We just have year after year after year of overall poor performance.
Yeah, I've only looked briefly through their plan, and I probably would like to have Fred Nathan on, the head of Think New Mexico, to more fully flesh out their plan. One of their ideas is to increase time in the classroom for New Mexico students. I'm fine with that. I don't have a huge problem with it. But overall, so we have a plan too. And our plan, first and foremost, is to empower parents and students to make the educational decisions, make the resources go where they prefer, not where the bureaucrats prefer for those dollars to go. I fundamentally believe that New Mexico having a government monopoly system in place in education is not a wise approach to education. I think going all the way back to the founding fathers of this country, if they had seen what even those tentative first investments, so-called investments in government operated, managed educational institutions, all the way from Jefferson at the University of Virginia to the school systems in place that came about afterwards, that has not worked out very well, either on the civic education front or in the educational attainment front. So, the real plan should be no plan. It should be money follow the students plan, and for that to be the accountability mechanism. So, what Think New Mexico, my impression is that there's a lot of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. And I'm not saying that to belittle what Think New Mexico does. I just think you have to get outside the scope of a one size fits all government monopoly situation where the incentives are not aligned towards educating the students, where the incentives are, what do the unions want? What are we going to do with critical race theory? What are we going to do about all these other side issues of gender and race, et cetera? And instead of actually teaching New Mexico children to be good workers and highly competent employees, informed about the history of their state and their nation as they move on to be better citizens as well. So I'll leave it there, but I definitely would like to have Fred, probably after the election, come on and discuss his education reforms. And I'll have some hard questions for Fred, as I always do. While Fred and I, Think New Mexico, we approach things differently, but we have a lot of respect for each other and are happy to have those candid discussions and sometimes debates and arguments as well, because that's what the battle of ideas is really all about. And interestingly enough, moving on to another issue, not to make this the Think New Mexico podcast, but I wanted to discuss something that Mr. Ronchetti and Michelle Lujan Grisham actually do agree on. This is not reimposing the grocery tax. Too often, as the Journal headline on this from Monday's paper says, Lujan, Grisham, Ronchetti agree, no food tax. Well, Dan McKay wrote the column. He didn't write the headline. I'm presuming somebody at the Journal who doesn't quite understand the nuance of New Mexico's taxation situation wrote that headline, because we have taxes on food. Your lovely wife, of course, more than anybody, knowing the taxes on restaurants and food purchased in a prepared context at a restaurant, fully taxed under the gross receipts tax. However, the groceries were eliminated from taxation at the behest of our friends at Think New Mexico under the Bill Richardson administration. And while at the time I would have said, and we did say that was not good tax policy, because it wasn't a tax cut. I mean, if you tell me, Paul, we're going to eliminate the tax on groceries, period, I say, yay, great idea. If you say, Paul, I'm going to eliminate the tax on groceries and raise the tax on gross receipts by 0.5 percentage point on everything else, I say, no, that is not good tax policy. But that's not where we are today. We are at a point where the option is really, should we reimpose the grocery tax or should we let things stay? Obviously, we want to reform massively the tax code. And so, this really shouldn't be about just reimposing the grocery tax or not. It should be about a thorough reboot of our entire tax structure. But Lujan Grisham and Ronchetti agree, don't reimpose the tax on groceries. With a $2.5 billion budget surplus and the amount of money we've spent in recent years, I think it's hard for any reasonable person to come to any other conclusion. Ron Keddy certainly has a better plan for reforming the GRT than Lujan Grisham, who has no plan. But Wally, that is my take on that issue, which again, our friends that think New Mexico got that food grocery tax eliminated, but it wasn't great policy, quite frankly.
No, and just the way that worked out is they had a hold harmless provision for the local taxing entities, and then the state of New Mexico didn't have enough money to honor that, and things did not work out as they were intended. But yeah, the gross receipts tax, if we're going to do something with it, I don't think food is one of the last. It's the most controversial, and frankly, and at how this thing is developed into such a an anti-business disaster. I think there's other more important reforms that are there. And yeah, I think my sense is that is reforming that is really not even on the radar of Michelle Lujan Grisham as something that even needs to be addressed. I think that if she's reelected, I think I'm not saying that the legislature might not throw bills. There have been bills and discussions for going on decades now to do more to reform the gross receipts tax, but it doesn't make it anywhere. And then way back to the point you made about the power of the governor, and in New Mexico, and as we see through COVID, kind of nationwide, the executives took power, and there were some legislative bodies that kind of pushed back on that. A lot did not. New Mexico is one of those, but something like gross receipts tax, the chances of that being reformed without the governor really, whoever it is, being out in front of it, I think is very limited chance of that even going anywhere. So.
Yeah, and one of the problems with the gross receipts tax, among many, is that it's so complicated and really lacking in transparency, and it should be right at the top of the agenda in this race. But it's a nuanced thing. It's a little tough for the average citizen to understand. I get that, but it's obviously got to be a top priority for anybody who wants to turn New Mexico's economy around. And unfortunately, just the dynamics of a campaign like this don't lend itself very well to making that a central focus of these campaigns. But certainly, Democrats and Lujan Grisham have never really taken that as a top priority issue. Ron Keddy certainly has outlined a pretty solid plan relating to the gross receipts tax. I quite frankly, would have made that the be all end all and much more central focus. There's been a lot of provisions that Ron Keddy's put out there that I think, could be done and should be done, but aren't. It really is the gross receipts tax. Number one, number two, number three priorities. It really is so important that we address that issue, and it hasn't been done for way too long. So
yeah, and then Paul, when people talk about diversify our economy in New Mexico, that's something that if you ask Democrats, Republicans, independents, is that a good thing? Absolutely. But then if you say, okay, now what if reform of the gross receipts tax is a major item that would absolutely help diversify our economy? That's where it tends to break down, at least historically, that the Democrats don't want to address that issue. So, it's one of those, you can use words. It's like we're for the idea, but not necessarily for some of the things that would be necessary to make it happen.
Yep. A think tank out in Pennsylvania, one of our sister think tanks, the Commonwealth Foundation, released a report on public sector labor laws. They rank New Mexico, not surprisingly, a D-. Our neighboring states, Arizona is a B, Utah is a C, Colorado is a C, Oklahoma is a C, Texas is an A+. some of the issues specifically relating to public employees. Are strikes illegal? Yes, in New Mexico and most other states, that's the case as well. Right to work, not a thing in New Mexico, and it's actually banned locally by state law. Paycheck protection, this is where the unions often get the access to your, if you're a union member or you're in a collective bargaining environment, you have money taken out of your paycheck before you even see it. And that happens right in New Mexico. In other places, you actually have to cut the union a check, which I think makes sense. You shouldn't have that money taken out by your employer automatically and handed over to the union without you ever seeing it. Overall, this is a very worthwhile report. Public employees are unfortunately unionized, something that Franklin Delano Roosevelt said was not a good idea, and we agree with him completely. So it's not really a matter of just reforming those laws. A lot of other states, including Virginia at one time, which had been an A plus in this report, because several states did not allow collective bargaining by government employees, but Virginia, under its Democratic rulers recently, allowed collective bargaining, and that of government employees specifically, and that's something. The whole policy bailiwick is something that's not good to have government unions sitting across the negotiating table from politicians they elect, and then they have the ability to really keep them in power if they give the unions what they want, and that's very unhealthy, at least in a private sector union situation. While we don't always agree with them, they are forced to adhere to certain economic realities, and if they fail to do that and make their businesses uncompetitive, they wind up essentially killing them, and there go the jobs that union needs to be a solvent, viable organization. And I think that's one of the saving graces here. We talked about Starbucks unionizing. Starbucks unions probably will, the people who actually go out and unionize for them will be, I think, somewhat disappointed, because I don't think it's going to change the operation of a Starbucks facility, their pay and benefits overly dramatically. But if you are in a government union, you really have a lot of power over those politicians, as we've seen with Lujan Grisham and the education unions, and they've really called the shots, not just here in New Mexico, but across the country for Democrat politicians.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul, the thing that I kind of come back to, and this is maybe not exactly the point you're making with public unions, but in terms of private unions, and there being a built-in feedback mechanism if they go too far. As there's a lot of places on the right to work argument that the states with right to work, a lot of them tend to have more union workers, and their union workforce grows as well as their non-union workforce, which is a little bit counterintuitive. But yes, with public unions, the marketplace isn't the thing that puts a brake on going too far. It's a political, explicitly political process, and that's not always the best at doing these things, as we've seen lots of places. So the things that government explicitly decides, the price and the rules and whatever, there have been problems, lots of areas of the economy.
Yeah, and quickly here in Albuquerque, we've talked in the past about the free bus ride, quote unquote, free bus ride system that they have in place, which according to Councilor Dan Lewis, has been a significant factor in increasing police calls for buses and bus stops about 25% from an already, I think, high level. And the idea that Lewis and Councilor Clarissa Pena have is, rather than just one, come all, get on the bus for free, free to them, of course, not free to us, they will have to apply or get a free bus card from the city that then they can use. And, you know, I'm not a fan of free buses. I think buses should be higher priced, $2 or $3. I'm not a fan of the idea of buses as a completely free government service. I think there should be a market-based mechanism in there. Even $1 is pretty low. And you see, and you've seen pictures and accounts on social media and on the news and elsewhere of buses being used to commit shoplifting and other kinds of crimes around the city. I think it's a very interesting question that should be studied as to what the increase in crime is associated with those bus routes being right by retail centers. Up Montgomery, for example, is one example. And but what Lewis and Pena are contemplating is better than the alternative, which is continuing the come all policy on Albuquerque's buses. It's going to be up for a vote here in City Council in the near future. I guess it may be even Monday. So I don't know if that's already been voted on, but it's something that is a small step in the right direction, Wally.
Yeah, and it's one of those things, Paul. There's a lot of studies in consumer economics and things you read over the years that if something is quote unquote free, it tends to be it's much more likely to be abused and not used, in a judicious manner. And by not even, and with the issue we have of homeless criminals, whatever, in the bus system, making them go and sign up for their quote free bus passes at least gives them some some hurdle that they need to jump over. The fact that they're just not going to use the bus if it's a convenient way to move stolen merchandise from a retail shoplifting theft. And I think as a bare minimum, that would be, it sounds to me like a good thing. So
yeah, it shows some level of competence mentally and preparedness to go and get that pass. And we'll see what City Council does. I haven't seen any news reporting that anything was done on it. There was a Friday editorial that said next week, but I don't know. These things can always be deferred and whatnot. Real quick, Wally, I know we're running out of time. The land commissioner race is something that normally we don't really talk a lot about, because the whole business of the land commissioner is to maximize revenue for our failing government school system. So as long as they maximize revenue, they work with the industry, oil and gas predominantly, to generate revenue. That's pretty much them doing the job. And we really haven't talked about Stephanie Garcia Richardson. She created that new logo for the land office when she took office, showing all the windmills and all the other ways that she was generating revenue. And she has, to her credit, increased somewhat the wind and solar and the amount of other sources of money, but still about 90+% of the land office's revenues come from oil and gas, which of course has boomed in recent years. But now she told the Albuquerque Journal in a survey, she said she wants to put a temporary moratorium on fracking permits, and this is a direct quote, for the oil industry on state trust land as a way to force the legislature to boost New Mexico royalty rates to match Texas's rates, an idea that has stalled in recent sessions at the Roundhouse. Now, how much of a threat this may be, and really why, because royalties are just one form of taxation paid by the oil and gas industry when they extract those resources. It's it's a little hard to say, but it would certainly not be a good thing for the land commissioner to become yet another obstacle for the industry doing business in the state of New Mexico.
Yeah, Paul, my neck got sore from shaking my head when I read that. You know, I see lots of issues with it. You know, the question about what royalty rate should be, first of all, it's only on state trust lands that this applies to. It doesn't apply to private lands. It doesn't apply to Bureau of Land Management or other federally controlled lands. And then, you know, it's only for new leases. Existing leases were constructed with a royalty rate. And it seems to me like this is I don't know. This seems to me like it has so many issues. You know, I don't know. The metaphor that came to mind with me is like, this reminded me of like doing brain surgery with boxing gloves on. It's like, if you want a higher royalty rate, go lobby the legislature and do it. You know, why do you need to do a fracking ban? And now, if you're going to do a fracking ban on new leases, you know, those new leases would be worthless until this issue. Now, if you're going to do a fracking ban on existing leases, get ready for the lawyers to come out. You know what I mean? And let's get ready for New Mexico's oil and gas industry to needlessly suffer. You know, it's one of those things like, let's reduce production that could have happened here, could have been done under some of the most stringent, environmentally strong regulations in the world, and let's move that elsewhere. You know, it just seems to me like that was clumsy. That must have come up on a focus group or something. You know what I mean? Because I think that that's a crazy idea. Now, with regard to the question of should royalty rates be higher, if you have Wally Drangmeister refers to the Laffer curve, you win on this one because it's kind of a Laffer curve issue. There's a point above which you would reduce revenue. Now, there's not lots of studies about whether, you know, raising it by 5 percentage points would do a lot to raise or lower overall revenues to the state trust lands. But you know, I would just say from a, you know, economic point of view, I don't think it's necessarily a good idea. It's as likely as not to have no impact on revenue or negative impact on revenue as it is to increase revenue. But this is something that it's a lot, it's one of these kind of, oh, they need to pay their fair share. Well, you know, they pay a lot in taxes and royalties as it is, and the state of New Mexico benefits fantastically from that. And so is this a good plan? I don't know. But the other thing is that she also could maybe get the legislature in a position. A lot of their funding for operations come through some fees and things. But the last I recall, they all get some of their budget from the legislature. And is that a fight she wants to pick? And then there are times where
Wally, I'm gonna jump right in there and say that we at the Rio Grande Foundation believe that dollars of all kinds are better spent in the private sector than in the government. I would be glad to have a 0% royalty rate on oil and gas and anything else coming out of the ground, because the state of New Mexico does a horrendous job of managing all forms of tax revenue. And, you know, ultimately, the education system does not work very well, even if it's merely a transfer system from the state to parents and families. I would much rather see those decisions made by the families themselves, and then to the extent necessary, some kind of subsidy being paid. You know, this money, as we've seen with the permanent funds and all other forms of New Mexico's budget, it's just not it's just not used very well. And that pretty much is the case with all forms of tax revenue that are dumped into the state of New Mexico. Until they can prove themselves effective managers of those dollars, I would rather, I'm of the opinion that the less is more when it comes to what is paid to the state of New Mexico.
Yeah, and Paul, that point is well taken. I think my statement buys into the issue about the state trust lands or a proxy as if they were owned by a private entity, and private entities lease oil and gas all the time. And there are different royalty rates. Some actually from time to time are even lower than that the state trust lands charge. And so what I'm saying is that there is a business decision there to be made under the system that we have, which admittedly is not a perfect one. But again, the state trust lands are operated for the benefit of the people of New Mexico to raise revenue that has some business-like, if you buy into that system, it has some business-like characteristics. And one of those is figuring out what the right level of royalty is that you don't, if you make the royalty 150% of revenues, we know how much oil and gas we're going to get developed.
Understood. Fair enough. I just want to throw in one thing I just noticed. The city council in Albuquerque rejected rent control legislation as a memorial. Only Feeblecorn and Benton supported a memorial that would have essentially lent support for repeal of a statewide law against rent control. That the law exists at the state level, and it would have been a memorial on the part of city council to support repeal of that law. Only 2 of the 9 councilors supported that. So that is good news. Some actually bona fide good news. Rent control is horrible, and it's a great way to destroy urban environments and make people want to flee again those cities where they impose rent control. But
and just a real quick one. The Lindbeck quote always comes to mind. In many cases, rent control appears to be the most efficient way presently known to destroy a city, except for bombing. And so, hats off to the city council. I think they made the right call. Albuquerque doesn't need rent control, hurting our city and making it. It does the exact opposite of most cases what it's designed to do. Yeah, and that was just a memorial, so we didn't follow it too closely, but it's good that a vast majority of the city council, even folks like Pat Davis, seem to have wisely chosen an alternative path. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointsnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.